You won't believe it, but one of the most unforgettable and provocative nights of my life happened a few weeks ago. The sun was setting, dyeing the sky a fiery orange, almost like an invitation to something irresistible. From my window at home, I watched the city lights begin to twinkle, while the soft sound of traffic and distant conversations seemed to be a soundtrack for what was to come. Normally, this scenario would calm me, but that night, the air was charged with a delicious tension, as if promising something I would never forget. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of our stories. My husband, John, had left earlier that afternoon to attend a weekend work retreat. He had travelled for work before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way he asked me in a more serious tone as he gave me a gentle kiss on the cheek. "Morgan," he said, looking into my eyes and lingering for a moment. "Take care of James while I'm gone. He's still getting used to it. I don't want him to feel like a stranger here. Make him feel at home, okay?" His nephew James was only 19 and had been staying with us for a few weeks. He had just graduated from high school and was preparing for college in the big city. When he arrived here, he showed up with his bag slung over his shoulders, a shy expression on his face, and a gleam in his eyes that was a mix of nervousness and gratitude. John had insisted that he stay with us until he was settled. I didn't mind, really. James was a polite, respectful young man with a quiet demeanour that made the atmosphere lighter. Still, that night, after John left, the house felt different. The dynamic between James and I had always been cordial, but as the sky darkened and the usual silence of the night took over the house, I felt something change slightly. Maybe it was the absence of John's reassuring presence, or maybe it was something else I couldn't explain. Around 7 p.m., the creaking of the stairs broke the silence. It was James who appeared in the doorway of the living room. His dark hair was a little messy, and he was wearing a simple sweatshirt and jeans. He gave me that shy smile that made him seem even younger than his 19 years. "Hi, Aunt Morgan," he said, his voice calm and full of warmth. "Hi, James," I replied, putting down the book I'd been pretending to be reading. "Your uncle asked me to make sure you don't feel abandoned while he's away." He chuckled, sitting down on the couch across from me. "He worries too much. I'm fine, really." We sat in silence for a few minutes, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was comfortable, even. I couldn't help but notice how at ease he looked, stretched out on the couch, his long legs taking up plenty of space, and his posture completely relaxed. He seemed more relaxed than ever. "Are you hungry?" I asked, breaking the silence. "To be honest, I am," he replied, sitting up a little straighter. "What's for dinner?" I stood up with a smile and gestured for him to follow me into the kitchen. "We'll figure it out together." And with that, the evening continued, a little different, but filled with an unexpected lightness. We opted for something simple, pasta with a quick homemade sauce. James, full of initiative, offered to help, and soon we were moving around the kitchen like a well-rehearsed team. He chopped the vegetables with a precision that surprised me, his hands steady and confident in the right rhythm, while I stirred the pan on the stove. The atmosphere was light, full of small laughter and relaxed conversation. "You have a way with this," I commented, watching as he chopped a tomato with such skill that he looked like a professional. He looked up with a playful smile. "Not as much as you, although I was pretty sure you would burn water." "Gross," I replied, laughing. It was impossible not to join in the joke. When dinner was ready, we sat at the dining table, illuminated by the soft light above, which made the room cozy. The conversation flowed naturally. We talked about his plans for college, his impressions of the city, and some hilarious stories about John when he was a kid. He spoke with a confident but calm tone that made me want to hear more. It was as if each word that came out of his mouth had a different weight that night. After we finished, we took the dishes to the sink and went back to the living room. James flopped down on the couch with that easy familiarity, taking up the space as if he'd been home for years. I settled into my chair, but I found myself constantly straying to him. There was something different about him tonight, a kind of presence I hadn't noticed before. He seemed so comfortable, so at ease, that it was impossible to ignore. "Thanks for dinner," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "It was great, and you didn't have to do all that." "It wasn't any effort," I said honestly. "I actually enjoyed it." A pause fell over the room, but it wasn't the kind of comfortable silence it had been before. It was thicker, filled with something neither he nor I had the courage to put into words. James's eyes met mine, and in that instant it felt like the room had shrunk. The distance between us seemed smaller, and the air felt heavier. After a moment he murmured, "I think I'll go to bed soon." Despite his words, he made no move to get up, as if something was keeping him there, in that shared stillness, where the unsaid spoke louder than any words. "Yes," I replied quietly, trying to hide the rapid rhythm of my heart. James remained still for a few more seconds, his gaze resting on me in a way that seemed intentional, almost studied. Then he smiled slightly, as if he had made a silent decision. With a calm movement, he stood up and stretched, his arms outstretched lazily. "Good night, Aunt Morgan," he said, his voice low and calm. "Good evening, James," I replied, forcing a matter-of-fact tone. I watched him walk up the stairs, his footsteps echoing softly across the hardwood floor until they disappeared into the hallway above. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I sat there in the living room, feeling the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. Something had changed that night, something I couldn't name, but it was certainly there. I wasn't ready to let the night end like this. The house was quiet now, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creaking of the wood as it seemed to adjust to the night's temperature. I stood in the living room for a while, staring at the dancing flames in the fireplace, lost in my thoughts. They always came back to James, to the way he smiled, the way his eyes seemed to examine me with unusual attention, the subtle energy he emanated that was impossible to ignore. Eventually, I decided to go upstairs. My footsteps were muffled by the carpet in the hallway as the deep silence of the house enveloped me. The dim light from a lamp near the guest room cast soft shadows on the walls. As I passed James's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, I hesitated. For a moment I stood there, listening to the sound of his even, calm breathing. It seemed almost comforting. I shook my head, trying to push my thoughts away. It was absurd. I walked into my room, closing the door behind me. The familiarity of the space should have comforted me, but it didn't. As I changed into my pajamas, the image of James kept invading my mind. His carefree smile, the way his gaze seemed to linger on me longer than necessary, the easy way he occupied the space around him. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was plunged into darkness, but inside me there was a bright, almost pulsing restlessness. My chest tightened with a confusing mix of emotions that I couldn't quite identify. I sighed, trying to erase the thoughts that stubbornly insisted on returning to him. The night seemed longer than usual. As I tossed and turned in bed, the minutes seemed like hours. The silence of the house, which had once been comforting, now seemed unsettling. Every little sound, the creak of the wood, the whisper of the wind outside, seemed amplified. I closed my eyes, trying to force sleep, but all I managed to do was increase the intensity of my thoughts. James. His face seemed engraved in my mind. Why was it so hard to ignore the memory of that exchange of glances? Maybe it was because, for the first time, he seemed more than just John's nephew. He wasn't just the polite, shy boy who had arrived with suitcases in his hands a few weeks ago. He seemed different, more confident, more intriguing. Finally, I gave up fighting my insomnia. I got up, deciding to have a glass of water in the kitchen. Maybe the simple ritual of walking around the house would help me calm my mind. Upon opening the bedroom door, the hallway seemed even darker than before. Only the dim glow of the nightlight illuminated the path, creating shadows that moved slightly with the breeze. As I approached the guest room, my breath caught for a moment. The door, previously only ajar, was now wide open. I hesitated, listening to the silence. The bed was empty. My heart skipped a beat. Where was he? Before I could think to call out to him, I heard a sound coming from the living room below. Light footsteps. James. I walked down slowly, the carpet muffling my footsteps as I approached the living room. The glow of the fireplace still warmed the room, but it was the sight of James, sitting on the couch, that made me stop in my tracks. He was staring into the flames, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. There was something different about his expression, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. "James?" I called softly, trying not to startle him. He turned slowly, and his usual smile was replaced by something softer, almost melancholic. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. I walked over, sitting in the armchair next to him. "Neither could I confessed. For a moment we stood there in silence. Only the sound of crackling wood filled the air, and that was when it all began. If you want to know the other part of the story, comment on part 2. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the rest of the story.